On the morning of December 7, 1941, the sun rose calmly over the waters of Pearl Harbor. The air was still, almost ceremonial. For the sailors anchored there, Sunday promised to be like so many others. Routine inspections, delayed mail, perhaps a few hours of rest before a new week of service. No one imagined that, within a few hours, that harbor would cease to be merely a naval base and become one of the most sacred and most tragic places in the history of the United States. Among the ships lined up along what was known as Battleship Row was the USS Arizona. An imposing battleship, a symbol of an era when naval power was measured by the size of guns and the thickness of armor. Commissioned in 1916, a veteran of exercises, diplomatic cruises, and decades of service, the Arizona was not there to fight that Sunday. It was anchored, at rest, vulnerable. When the first Japanese aircraft appeared in the Hawaiian sky, few immediately understood what was happening. Some thought it was an exercise. Others, an unexpected visit. That initial confusion would cost precious seconds, and thousands of lives. The attack launched by the Imperial Japanese Navy did not seek merely to destroy ships. It had a far deeper psychological and strategic objective: to neutralize the United States Pacific Fleet before it could even react. The USS Arizona was struck shortly after the attack began. An armor-piercing bomb, dropped from high altitude, penetrated the deck near turret number 2. Within seconds, it reached the forward ammunition magazine. What followed was not just an explosion, but a catastrophic detonation. A white flash, a wave of fire and steel that nearly tore the ship in half. The battleship, pride of the fleet, was instantly transformed into a burning tomb. Inside the Arizona, more than 1,000 men had no chance at all. Officers, sailors, young recruits, and seasoned veterans vanished in an instant. Of the roughly 1,500 crewmen aboard, 1,177 died right there. Not in prolonged combat, not after hours of resistance, but in mere seconds of absolute destruction. Many never even understood what was happening. The ship sank slowly, shrouded in black smoke and persistent flames. Unlike other battleships damaged that day, the Arizona would never be refloated. The damage was too great. The structure was irreparably compromised. The hull would remain where it fell, in the shallow harbor, with the bodies of hundreds of sailors still trapped inside. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed the course of the war and the history of the 20th century. But within that colossal event, the fate of the USS Arizona holds a singular place. It became the greatest human symbol of surprise, vulnerability, and the immediate cost of war. Not merely a lost ship, but an entire community erased in minutes. Today, above the submerged hull of the Arizona, rests a silent memorial. Drops of oil still slowly rise to the surface, a phenomenon known as the tears of the Arizona. To many, it is as if the ship continues to weep for its dead. To others, it is a constant reminder that that morning never truly ended. In this narrative we will go back in time. We will understand who these men were, why the Arizona was there, how the attack was planned and executed, and why this specific battleship became the symbolic heart of Pearl Harbor. Because the 1,177 sailors who never left that harbor are not just numbers in a history book. They are the living memory of a moment when the world changed forever. And it all begins long before the bombs fell from the sky. Long before it became a submerged tomb, the USS Arizona was born as a promise. Its keel was laid in 1914, at a time when the United States was still observing the European war from a distance but already understood that the 20th century would demand a navy worthy of global ambitions. Built at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the battleship represented the peak of American naval engineering of its era. A wide hull, heavy armor, and 14-inch guns capable of striking targets at distances that, only a few years earlier, would have seemed unimaginable. When it was launched in 1915 and officially commissioned in 1916, the Arizona entered service in a world that still believed in the absolute supremacy of the great battleships. The dominant idea was simple and almost dogmatic. Naval wars would be decided by direct clashes between lines of heavy ships, exchanging devastating broadsides until one side was reduced to smoking wreckage. The Arizona was designed precisely for that kind of confrontation, resilient, powerful, and built to hold the battle line even under intense fire. The First World War, however, would end without the ship firing a single shot at the enemy. The Arizona arrived too late to take part in direct combat, serving mainly in escort and training missions. For many crewmen, this was a source of quiet frustration. They served aboard one of the most modern ships in the world, yet the war always seemed to happen somewhere else with other men in other seas. In the years that followed, the Arizona became part of the routine of the U.S. Navy. It crossed the Atlantic, participated in fleet exercises, hosted foreign officers, and transported officials on diplomatic voyages. In 1919, it received the symbolic honor of escorting the President of the United States across the ocean, a gesture that reinforced its status not only as a weapon, but as an instrument of policy and national prestige. Throughout the 1920s, life aboard followed a predictable, almost monotonous rhythm. Long stretches at sea, constant maintenance, gunnery drills, formal inspections. For younger sailors, the Arizona was a world unto itself, a maze of metal corridors, stifling compartments, and decks swept by salty wind. Many spent months without setting foot on land. Others saw the ship as a career, an identity, a place to which they belonged. As the years passed, technology began to advance faster than the ships themselves. Aircraft grew faster with greater range and payload. Submarines evolved quietly, becoming more lethal and harder to detect. Even so, American naval doctrine, like that of other powers, remained centered on the battleship. The Arizona, though no longer the most modern ship in the fleet, remained relevant. It was updated, reinforced, adapted. A respected veteran in a navy that still believed in its steel giants. In the 1930s, the world began once again to tilt toward conflict. Tensions rose in Europe and the Pacific. Japanese expansion, German rearmament, and global instability made every naval exercise more serious, every maneuver more laden with foreboding. For the Arizona and its crew, these changes were felt gradually, almost imperceptibly. More training. More alerts. More speeches about readiness and duty. When the battleship was permanently assigned to Hawaii as part of the Pacific Fleet, the decision had a clear strategic purpose: to demonstrate presence, deter aggression, and project power in the Pacific. For many sailors, however, Pearl Harbor felt like a distant, almost exotic posting. A place of mild climate, green mountains in the background, and calm waters, far removed from the classic image of a battlefield. By late 1941, the Arizona was anchored in a relatively quiet position alongside other battleships. There was no immediate expectation of combat. Diplomatic tensions with Japan existed, but few believed a direct attack on American territory was imminent. The prevailing mood was one of cautious vigilance, not extreme urgency. Aboard the ship, life continued through its small rituals. Letters were written. Watches were changed. Some men planned shore leave. Others simply waited for the next call of duty. None of them knew that, in that apparent calm, the Arizona was already marked, that its history, built over decades of service, was about to converge into a single instant, a moment as brief as it would be devastating. And when that moment arrived, there would be no time for classical heroism, for clear orders or desperate maneuvers. Only fire, impact, and silence. But to fully understand what happened that morning, we must now leave the deck of the Arizona and look across the ocean, to the men who planned, with cold precision, the attack that would change everything. Thousands of kilometers from Pearl Harbor, the attack had been decided long before the first aircraft ever lifted off a carrier deck. In Japan, war was no longer seen as a distant possibility, but as a narrowing path that tightened with each passing month. Economic embargoes, especially on oil, pressed relentlessly against the empire. For Tokyo, continuing its expansion in Asia meant confronting the United States sooner or later. The question was no longer if there would be war, but how it would begin. At the center of this dilemma stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet. Yamamoto knew the United States well. He had studied there, understood its industrial capacity, and, more importantly, grasped its psychology. He knew Japan could not win a long war against a nation capable of producing ships, aircraft, and weapons on an almost limitless scale. If conflict was inevitable, it had to begin with a blow so powerful that it would paralyze the enemy, at least temporarily. From that logic, the idea of attacking Pearl Harbor was born. The plan was so bold that many considered it insane. Never before had a carrier fleet crossed half the ocean in complete radio silence to launch a surprise air attack against a heavily defended base. Success depended on a flawless chain of factors: total secrecy, precise navigation, perfect coordination, and above all, complete surprise. A single mistake could expose the Japanese fleet to a devastating counterattack. The task force assigned to the mission became known as Kido Butai. It was the elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy, 6 aircraft carriers, escorted by cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. On board were hundreds of aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, and pilots trained obsessively for that single mission. Many knew they were participating in something historic. Few knew whether they would return. The fleet departed in late November 1941, sailing along a northern route far from major shipping lanes. Silence was absolute. No radio transmissions. No errors allowed. Each undetected day increased the chances of success, and the tension on board. The men understood that if they were discovered, they would be deep in enemy waters, with little room to maneuver or escape. Meanwhile, at Pearl Harbor, the atmosphere remained relatively calm. Warnings existed, but they were vague. American authorities expected provocation or attack in places like the Philippines, Malaya, or the Dutch East Indies. Hawaii was considered too distant, too well protected. The idea of a large-scale air attack against the base seemed improbable to many strategists. In the early hours of December 7, the Kido Butai reached its launch position. The ocean was calm. The sky was clear. As dawn approached, engines began to roar. Aircraft lifted off one by one from the Japanese carriers, forming carefully planned waves of attack. Each pilot had a designated target. Every second was calculated. The American battleships lined up in Pearl Harbor became priority targets. To Japanese planners, they represented the visible heart of U.S. naval power. Among them was the USS Arizona, not because it was the most modern but because it was their exposed part of a collective symbol that had to be broken. When the first wave reached Oahu, surprise was nearly total. Anti-aircraft defenses were slow to respond. American aircraft sat lined up on the ground, many destroyed before they could even take off. Within minutes, the harbor was transformed into chaos, explosions, smoke, and confusion everywhere. Amid this scene, the Arizona remained anchored, part of its crew still waking up, others engaged in routine duties. There was no time for full dispersal, no chance to prepare the ship for full combat readiness. When the bombs began to fall, the battleship was exactly where Japanese planners expected it to be. The fate of the Arizona would be sealed quickly, but not in isolation. It was part of an attack meant to rewrite the balance of power in the Pacific in a single morning. And yet, no strategy, no matter how meticulous, could have predicted the symbolic and human weight that ship would carry after the flames died down. To understand the true impact of what happened, we must now return to the harbor, to the final minutes of normality aboard the Arizona, moments before time itself seemed to stop forever. Just before 8 o'clock in the morning, aboard the USS Arizona, Sunday followed its slow, familiar rhythm. Some men were heading to breakfast. Others were on duty in the lower compartments, tending to tasks that seemed far too ordinary to deserve special attention. The ship was at a reduced state of readiness. Ammunition was locked away. Anti-aircraft guns were not fully manned. Nothing suggested that, within minutes, that routine would be obliterated. The first real sign of danger did not come through clear orders or well-coordinated alarms, but through sound. A distant roar, strange, unmistakable. Then explosions in different parts of the harbor. Understanding arrived in fragments, almost unreal. Aircraft bearing Japanese markings tore across the sky. Bombs were falling. The attack was real. Aboard the Arizona, the general alarm was sounded, but time was no longer an ally. Crewmen ran to their stations. Officers struggled to organize defenses amid confusion and disbelief. Anti-aircraft guns began firing, often manned by improvised crews. There had been no rehearsal for this. Only instinctive reaction. The first nearby explosions rocked the ship, sending shrapnel and twisted metal across the deck. Japanese dive bombers plunged almost vertically, releasing their bombs with calculated precision. The Arizona was initially struck by near misses that caused limited damage. But the decisive blow was still coming. At 8:06 a.m., an armor-piercing bomb dropped from high altitude struck the ship near turret number 2 forward on the bow. Unlike other impacts, it did not immediately produce a visible explosion. The bomb pierced the armor deck and plunged deep into the ship's interior. In fractions of a second, it reached the forward ammunition magazine, where vast quantities of powder and artillery shells were stored. What followed was total devastation. A colossal explosion tore through the Arizona from the inside out. The bow was violently lifted. A massive fireball rose hundreds of feet into the air. The forward turret was ripped from its base. Men were hurled skyward like shadows against a sky filled with black smoke. The battleship, which seconds earlier was still struggling to respond, was mortally wounded in a single instant. Most of the 1,177 sailors who died aboard the Arizona lost their lives at that very moment. Many were in the lower decks near the magazine. Others were consumed by flames or crushed beneath collapsing structures. There was no time to escape, no time to call for help. For them, the war began and ended at the same instant. The battleship began to sink slowly, listing, wrapped in continuous fire. Burning oil spread across the surface of the water, turning the harbor into a liquid inferno. Nearby ships tried desperately to respond, while improvised rescue teams searched for survivors among floating debris and wounded men struggling to stay afloat. A small number of Arizona crewmen managed to escape. Many had been stationed in outer areas or were thrown into the water by the force of the blast. For these survivors, the psychological shock was immediate and permanent. They had watched their ship, their home, be destroyed in seconds, taking with it friends, superiors, and shipmates with whom they had shared daily life. Unlike other battleships damaged that day, there was no realistic attempt to save the Arizona. The fires were too intense. The structure was irreparably compromised. Priority shifted to containing nearby blazes and preventing the flames from spreading further through Pearl Harbor. While the attack continued, the Arizona was already beyond saving. Its role in the battle had ended almost at the same moment it began. But the impact of its destruction was only just beginning to unfold, in the minds of survivors within the United States Navy, and soon across an entire nation that did not yet fully grasp what that morning truly meant. When the sound of enemy engines finally faded and the smoke began to clear, the battleship remained there, partially submerged and silent. A heavy silence, broken only by occasional flames and the frantic rescue efforts nearby. Beneath the water, trapped within the shattered hull, were the men who would never leave Pearl Harbor. Yet the fate of the USS Arizona did not end that day. The way it would be remembered, and preserved, would transform that wreck into something far greater than a ship lost in combat. And that is what we begin to understand next, as the attack ends and the full weight of the tragedy finally reveals itself. When the last Japanese aircraft disappeared over the horizon, Pearl Harbor did not immediately return to silence. What followed was a scene of exhausted confusion, thick smoke, lingering fires, and the heavy smell of burned oil that seemed to cling to everything. For the men who survived, the feeling was not relief but shock. War had arrived without warning and the price had been paid brutally. Around the USS Arizona, improvised rescue teams worked amid floating debris and still burning wreckage. Cries for help echoed between damaged ships. Men covered in soot were pulled from the water, many gravely wounded, others silent, unable to process what they had just lived through. In the case of the Arizona, however, it quickly became clear that little could be done. Most of the crew was irretrievably lost. In the hours and days that followed, U.S. Navy divers began inspecting the shattered hull. What they found confirmed the worst fears. The magazine explosion had obliterated entire compartments. Passageways had collapsed. The ship's interior had become an unstable maze of twisted steel. Any large-scale rescue attempt would only place more lives at risk. Some bodies were recovered, especially from areas closer to the exterior. But most of the dead remained where they had fallen. Officially, the Arizona was declared a total loss. Unlike other battleships sunk at Pearl Harbor, such as the West Virginia or the California, it would not be raised, repaired, or returned to service. The decision was practical but also symbolic. The ship was beyond recovery. As the days passed, the fires were finally brought under control, but the Arizona's hull continued to release oil. A slow, steady seep, visible on the surface of the water. It became a permanent reminder that below, the ship was still present in some way, not as a weapon but as a grave. Many sailors began to refer to this oil as tears, an image that took deep root in collective memory. Meanwhile, the human scale of the tragedy began spreading across the American mainland. Telegrams were sent. Families received brief, impersonal notifications, often without details: missing in action, presumed dead. For parents, wives, and siblings, the name Arizona became synonymous with loss, even for those who had never seen the ship or the waters of Hawaii. Strategically, the attack on Pearl Harbor produced the opposite long-term effect Japan had hoped for. Far from paralyzing the United States, the destruction of the Arizona and other ships ignited an unprecedented national mobilization. The following day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared war, calling the attack a date which will live in infamy. For many Americans, the image of the Arizona burning became the visual embodiment of that infamy. Within the Navy itself, the sinking of the battleship began to change long-held assumptions. That such a powerful ship could be destroyed in seconds by an aerial attack accelerated a process already underway: the reassessment of the battleship's role in modern warfare. The Arizona did not fall in a gunnery duel. It was a victim of a new era, one in which control of the sky had become as decisive as command of the sea. As the war progressed, Pearl Harbor was repaired, expanded, and transformed into an even more vital base for operations in the Pacific. The Arizona, however, was left untouched. Its rusting hull became part of the harbor's landscape. For sailors passing by, it was impossible not to lower their voices, not to look with respect at that particular patch of water. Over time, a quiet debate emerged. What should be done with the Arizona? Some argued for removing the wreckage. Others believed the ship should remain exactly where it lay, as a permanent witness to the attack. Gradually, the second view prevailed. The battleship was no longer just a military wreck, it was a site of memory. Slowly, the USS Arizona ceased to be only a symbol of destruction and became a place of remembrance. A physical reminder that war, before strategy and politics, is made of interrupted lives. From that understanding grew the idea of preserving the site, not as a monument to victory, but as a tribute to the men who never had the chance to return home. But transforming a war grave into a memorial is not simple. It requires time, consensus, and above all, respect. That transformation would take years, evolving alongside the way the United States itself came to understand the attack on Pearl Harbor. It is in this period, between a war still raging and a memory beginning to solidify, that the story of the Arizona enters its next chapter. As the war in the Pacific advanced, Pearl Harbor ceased to be merely the site of a tragedy and became the main logistical hub of the American offensive. Ships came and went, entire fleets passed through the harbor on their way to decisive battles across the Pacific. The pace was intense, almost impersonal. And yet, amid this constant activity, the submerged hull of the USS Arizona remained motionless, a forced pause in the collective memory. For many sailors who served in Hawaii during the war, passing by the Arizona was a quiet moment of acknowledgement. There were no formal ceremonies. Just lingering glances and a tacit understanding that this place was not like the others. It was a war grave. A space where more than 1,000 men remained on duty, bound forever to the ship that had been their final post. When the war ended, the question of what to do with the Arizona resurfaced with greater urgency. The United States emerged victorious but deeply marked. There was a growing desire to remember, not only to celebrate. Pearl Harbor needed to be understood, contextualized, preserved. And the Arizona was the unavoidable center of that remembrance. In the first years after the war, the ship remained largely unchanged. Occasional visitors approached in small boats. Veterans returned in silence, many for the first time since 1941. For some survivors of the attack, looking at the Arizona meant reliving the exact moment when youth, security, and the illusion of invulnerability had been violently stripped away. The idea of building a permanent memorial began to gain support during the 1950s. It would not be a traditional monument with heroic statues or symbols of triumph. The concept was different: to create a place of contemplation suspended above the ship that would not touch the hull, would not disturb the remains, and would respect the site as a burial place. In 1962, that vision became reality with the inauguration of the USS Arizona Memorial. Its white, understated structure deliberately contrasts with the violence of the history it shelters. It does not rest on the ship, but spans it symbolically, allowing visitors to look down at the submerged hull just beneath the surface of the water. Inside the memorial, the names of the 1,177 sailors who died are engraved in marble. There are no ranks highlighted, no hierarchy. Officers and enlisted men appear side by side, united in the same final line. This choice was intentional. It reflects the reality of that day. The explosion did not distinguish rank or duty. Death was collective, instantaneous, indiscriminate. One detail captures the attention of nearly every visitor. Even decades after the sinking, small drops of oil continue to rise from the Arizona's hull, forming iridescent patches on the water's surface. Scientifically, it is simply residual fuel slowly leaking. Symbolically, it has become something far greater. The so-called tears of the Arizona reinforce the feeling that the ship still breathes, still remains present. Administration of the memorial was entrusted to the National Park Service, which took on the challenge of preserving the site both physically and historically. This includes monitoring the deterioration of the hull, studying ways to prevent more severe leaks, and at the same time maintaining controlled, respectful public access. Over the decades, the memorial has become one of the most visited sites in Hawaii. Millions of people from around the world cross the harbor in silence, enter the white structure, and look down at the dark shadow of the battleship. For many, it is their first true encounter with the human dimension of the Second World War, not through abstract numbers but through a place where absence is tangible. For the survivors of the USS Arizona, the memorial took on an even deeper meaning. Over the years, some expressed the wish that after death, their ashes be placed within the ship's hull, alongside the shipmates they lost in 1941. The U.S. Navy authorized this practice in specific cases. And so, even decades later, the Arizona continues to receive its men back. The battleship that never fired a shot in combat became, paradoxically, one of the most powerful symbols of American naval warfare. Not because of victories but because of sacrifice. Not because of movement but because of permanence. It reminds us that war at sea is not made only of great decisive battles, but also of moments of absolute vulnerability. And yet, the story of the USS Arizona does not end with the memorial. Its impact extends far beyond the physical site. It shaped how the United States remembers Pearl Harbor, how the war is taught to future generations, and how the true cost of strategic surprise is understood. To fully grasp this legacy, we must now look to the men, not only those who died but also those who survived. The ones who carried the Arizona with them for the rest of their lives. For the men who survived the USS Arizona, the end of the attack did not mean the end of the war. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a life divided into two very distinct parts. Before and after December 7, 1941. Many continued to serve throughout the conflict, crossing the Pacific aboard other ships, fighting in decisive battles, carrying with them the constant memory of a ship that no longer existed, and of friends who would never return. The psychological weight of survival was profound. Some escaped by chance, because they happened to be in exposed positions because they were thrown into the water by the explosion, or simply because they were in the right place at the wrong moment. For many, survival brought a lingering, silent guilt. Why did I live? Why didn't they? Questions that rarely found answers. For years, many of these men spoke little about what they had experienced. The generation that fought the Second World War was shaped by a sense of duty and emotional restraint. Trauma was carried quietly. Only decades later, already elderly, did some begin to share in greater detail what they saw, heard, and felt that morning. Their memories, often fragmented, helped reconstruct the Arizona's final moments through human perspectives, not just official reports. Veterans' reunions became delicate occasions. When Arizona survivors met, there was little need for words. A glance, a pause, a name spoken softly was enough. Every reunion was also a confrontation with absence. Many knew exactly who had been in which compartment when the explosion occurred. They knew who likely never had a chance. Over time, these survivors became involuntary guardians of the ship's memory. Schools, universities, and historical institutions invited them to speak at lectures and ceremonies. For young people who knew Pearl Harbor only through textbooks, hearing a first-hand account made the history immediate, concrete, almost tangible. One particularly symbolic expression of this lifelong bond with the ship was the U.S. Navy's decision to allow Arizona survivors to have their ashes placed within the hull after death. These ceremonies are quiet and deeply respectful, conducted outside public visiting hours. A diver descends into the ship and deposits the ashes in designated compartments. There are no long speeches, only a final return to a place that never stopped being home. The meaning of this gesture is powerful. For these men, the USS Arizona did not sink only in 1941. It remained present throughout their lives. Returning to it, even after death, is a way of closing a cycle that was brutally interrupted. The collective memory of Pearl Harbor was also shaped by these voices. Over the decades, the attack came to be understood not merely as a military event, but as a national trauma. The Arizona, more than any other ship, became the emotional center of that memory. It is no coincidence that it is often the first name mentioned when that day is recalled. As time passed, new generations began visiting the memorial. Children, teenagers, young adults, many with no direct connection to the war, walked quietly across the site. They did not know the world of 1941, nor the shock of absolute surprise. And yet, something in that space communicates a clear message. History is not abstract. It happens to real people in real places, and leaves marks that endure across generations. The USS Arizona, motionless on the harbor floor, became a symbolic anchor. It prevents Pearl Harbor from fading into a distant date or a vague concept. As long as the ship remains there, history stays grounded, in the physical, the human, the irreversible. But this permanence also raises difficult questions. The hull continues to deteriorate slowly. The oil, though now monitored and controlled, is finite. Engineers, historians, and conservationists know the Arizona is not eternal. Preserving it is a race against time, not to keep it intact forever, but to ensure its story continues to be told with accuracy and respect. And it is precisely this tension between memory and the passage of time that brings us to the next stage of this narrative, the strategic and symbolic legacy of the USS Arizona within the broader history of naval warfare in the Second World War. Because despite its early destruction, the Arizona profoundly influenced how the United States fought, and ultimately won, the war at sea. That influence begins at the moment the Navy realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The destruction of the USS Arizona was not only a human tragedy. It was a doctrinal shock. That morning, as smoke still rose over Pearl Harbor, something fundamental changed forever in how the United States, and the world, understood warfare at sea. For decades, the battleship had been the center of naval strategy. It represented concentrated power, resilience, supremacy. The Arizona embodied that belief. Yet its loss made one brutal truth impossible to ignore. Armor and guns offered no protection against an enemy that came from the sky. The threat no longer needed to appear on the horizon. It could descend from above, fast, precise, devastating. In the days following the attack, Navy officers analyzed every detail. Reports, testimonies, aerial photographs. The focus was not only on what had been lost but on how it had been lost. The Arizona never had a chance to fight, not because of any failure by its crew, but because the kind of war it had been designed for was already becoming obsolete. This realization did not arrive instantly, nor without resistance. Many officers still believed the battleship would have its decisive moment in a great surface engagement. But Pearl Harbor, and the Arizona in particular, planted an irreversible doubt. If a single air attack could destroy, in seconds, a ship that had taken years to build, then something had to change. And it did. As damaged battleships were repaired or assessed, one fact stood out: the American aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor during the attack. They had escaped by circumstance, not by design. Even so, they immediately became the focus of attention. They, not the massive battleships, now clearly carried the real ability to project power across vast distances. The war in the Pacific began to move to a different rhythm. Instead of slow, predictable battle lines, combat revolved around range, intelligence, and timing. Whoever found the enemy first, whoever launched aircraft first, held the decisive advantage. The ocean became a three-dimensional battlefield: surface, depth, and sky. In this new reality, the USS Arizona came to represent more than a loss. It became a lesson. A silent reference point behind every strategic decision that followed. When pilots took off for Midway, when fleets advanced toward the Marianas, when the United States adopted the island-hopping strategy, the memory of Pearl Harbor was present, not as blind revenge but as a constant warning. For the men planning the war, the Arizona was a reminder of what happens when readiness fails, when surprise is underestimated, when old certainties are trusted for too long. For the men fighting it, the Arizona was a reason the war had to be won. Even after victory in 1945, the ship's legacy continued to shape decisions. The U.S. Navy never again concentrated all its power in a single type of vessel. Diversification, flexibility, and integration between forces became core principles. In silence, the sunken battleship influenced the future. Over time, Pearl Harbor ceased to be only a military turning point and became a moral landmark. The USS Arizona, motionless beneath the water, came to symbolize the invisible line between a world that believed itself protected by oceans and another that understood no distance guarantees safety. Perhaps that is why the Arizona still touches something so deep. It does not tell a story of heroic combat in the traditional sense. There was no advance, no victory that day. There was sudden loss, disorientation, and grief. Yet it was precisely from that loss that a collective determination emerged, one that reshaped the course of the war. Still, no strategic analysis, no institutional legacy, can fully capture the human meaning of the USS Arizona. Because in the end, everything returns to the 1,177 sailors who never left Pearl Harbor. Ordinary men with simple routines, modest dreams, lives cut short in an instant they did not choose. It is for them that this story continues to be told. And as long as the hull of the Arizona rests on the harbor floor, that story will never truly be finished. Yet there is still one final dimension to explore: the way time, memory, and forgetting struggle for space around that silent ship. And it is toward that invisible confrontation that we now turn. Time moves differently at Pearl Harbor. For the world, decades have passed since 1941. Wars have come and gone. Technologies were born, aged, and disappeared. But there, above the calm waters of the harbor, the USS Arizona remains suspended in a permanent present, where past and memory meet every day. The hull continues to deteriorate slowly, like any structure subjected to salt, pressure, and time. Engineers know that nothing made by human hands is eternal. And yet, every decision surrounding the Arizona carries an almost ritual care. This is not about preserving metal alone, but about respecting a space where history and death became permanently intertwined. The drops of oil that still rise from the ship are small, nearly imperceptible. Scientifically, they are expected remnants. Humanly, they have become an impossible symbol to ignore. They remind us that the Arizona is not merely a monument. It is a place where something is still happening even in silence. A place that refuses to be fully confined to the past. Every day, visitors enter the memorial with different expectations. Some arrive driven by historical curiosity. Others by reverence. Some know every detail of the attack. Others know only that something important happened there. Yet almost all leave in silence. Not because it is required, but because the place seems to demand it. As if the ship itself, unseen beneath the water, were asking for respect. The power of the USS Arizona lies precisely in this. It does not explain, argue, or dramatize. It simply exists. And that presence changes those who witness it. It is impossible to look at that patch of water without thinking of the men who woke up that morning unaware they would never see sunset. Impossible to ignore that every name carved in marble represents an entire life ended in seconds. In a world where history is often reduced to dates, statistics, and speeches, the Arizona restores war to its rawest dimension, the human one. It reminds us that strategies have consequences, that political decisions fall upon individuals, and that surprise and complacency carry real costs. Perhaps that is why the USS Arizona remains one of the most powerful symbols of the Second World War. Not because it marked the moment the United States entered the conflict. That is something books can explain. But because it embodies the exact instant when the illusion of safety vanished. The moment an entire nation realized it was vulnerable, and that this vulnerability had faces, names, and families. The 1,177 sailors who never left Pearl Harbor did not die in a distant or anonymous battle. They remain where they fell. They guard the harbor, the memorial, and the memory of the attack itself. In a sense, they continue to stand watch, not with weapons but with meaning. As long as people are willing to cross those waters in silence, as long as someone pauses to watch the oil shimmer on the surface, as long as a name carved in marble is read softly aloud, the USS Arizona will never be just a wreck. It will remain a warning, a remembrance, and a commitment. A commitment not to forget that history does not happen only in the great movements of nations, but in the final seconds of ordinary men, caught by war on a peaceful morning. And that is why the USS Arizona never left Pearl Harbor. Because some ships sink. But others remain, forever, anchored in memory.